Good morning. My name is Anna Lang and I'm the Deputy Manager for the REF. Welcome to this morning's REF webinar on the consultation features Impact, Environment and Institutional Level Assessment. This is the third in a series of 3 webinars that we have run, intended to complement the REF consultation events that we held in January. Through these webinars, we have presented some of the key proposals from the consultation, but also thought about the kind of feedback and comments that we've had from the consultation events, with an opportunity to reflect on this discussion and issues raised. Through the webinars, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions, and the slides are broken up to allow those questions to be answered in stages. So firstly, I'll hand over to Kim Hackett, REF Manager, to go through the first feature, Impact, and then there'll be some opportunities for questions. Then I'll run through Environment, so both of these will be at a unit of assessment level, and a further opportunity for questions. We'll then move on to the proposals relating to institutional level assessment, both Impact and Environment, with questions at each section. So please do look for the black button at the bottom of your slides that says Ask Question, if you do wish to address anything to us. We have experienced quite a large number of questions in previous webinars. If we're unable to get through all of the questions, we'll do our best to answer those afterwards. So it is important to try and leave an accurate email address for yourself when you're asking those questions. As this is the third in the series of webinars, we will be publishing the webinars afterwards. So firstly, the slides from each of the 3 webinars will be published on the HEFCE website later today. That is on the web pages where you'll find the consultation proposals. Then on Wednesday, we will be in a position to publish the recordings from each of the 3 webinars, so you'll be able to hear the presentations again with all the questions that were. As I mentioned, we have received more questions than we've been able to answer on the day themselves. So we're at the moment putting together a package of frequently asked questions, which we will try and publish to answer some of the outstanding questions from the webinar on staff and outputs that took place on Thursday, and also any questions that we're unable to get to today. So I think that's all of the housekeeping. So I will pass over to Kim to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. My name's Kim Hackett. I'm the REF Manager, and I'm first going to take us through just a little bit of background. I'll keep this brief because for many of you, this might be now the 3rd time you're hearing it. But I just want to outline some of the background to developing the consultation. So our consultation launched on the 8th of December, and the proposals in it are based on 2 things, which is our evaluation evidence gathered on the 2014 exercise and the recommendations made in Lord Stern's review. Lord Stern's recommendations seek to implement an exercise that's lower burden than the previous exercise, that addresses some of the common issues identified in relation to previous assessment exercises, such as the impact on staff recruitment around the census date, to give an exercise with a more institutional focus, a more rounded view of research in submitted units, and to recognise the investment made by institutions in research. The recommendations aim to give more flexibility to institutions, giving space for longer-term research as well. There's an increased emphasis on interdisciplinary research and an emphasis on broadening the definition of impact, which we will touch on today. So the slide here shows the key areas on which, the key features on which we're consulting on the next REF, and how we can best implement those recommendations from Stern in the assessment exercise. We've engaged widely. As Anna mentioned, we've held 5 consultation events, as well as visiting groups both from different discipline areas and different groups of types of institution as well. This engagement has been characterised by open discussion, in which we've been able to gather a range of different perspectives on the proposals so far. It's been really helpful for us to give us this emerging view of where the areas of consensus and difference are, and we've heard they've also been helpful for those attending our events in terms of helping their consultation responses. So we're continuing to engage through the webinars that we've been holding. As this slide shows, we're now on the third of our webinars, and Anna has already outlined our lineup for today. So we're focusing on impact, environment and institutional level assessment. Our engagement so far has focused probably more intently on the institutional level assessment, being that area which is a new aspect of the assessment compared to previous exercises. But there are also a range of proposals set out in the consultation on impact and environment, so it's important for us to spend some time reflecting on these areas and getting your feedback as well. So, moving on then. To start with the proposals on impact. Lord Stern's review recommended a broadening and deepening of the definition of impact. And this was really in reflection of concern raised about the constraints on submitting different examples of impact because of the guidance around impact in the previous exercise. There was a particular feeling that some types of impact were not submissible within the guidelines, particularly those around research expertise, given the link to particular outputs, which I'll come on to next. But there is also, in Lord Stern's recommendation, an emphasis on increased clarity for certain areas of impact, perhaps to give increased reassurance to institutions about submitting examples, for instance, around public engagement. So we're seeking views on what additional guidance can be provided here. We're also seeking to align our definition of impact with the Research Council's. In the consultation proposal, we've set out two definitions, one of academic impact and one of wider impact. It's our view that academic impact is best assessed within the research outputs section of the REF, and the wider impact would be the definition we'd use for the impact case studies in that impact element of the exercise. And then finally, we're also seeking views on the criteria for impact in the REF. So we're sticking with reach and significance as the assessment criteria, but we're aware that there is some concern and some lack of clarity on the holistic assessment of these criteria in the previous exercise. So we're seeking views on what additional guidance we could provide around this if any further guidance is thought to be needed. So moving on then to think about impact arising from research activity or a body of work. So this is seeking to broaden the relationship between impact described in the case studies and the underpinning research, broaden it out from a link to research outputs alone. As I mentioned, this is intended to allow submission into the exercise of types of impact that may have been constrained in being returned last time. So, for instance, impacts that are derived from a group or individual's research expertise built up over perhaps a longer period of time and which does not necessarily result in specific outputs to which that impact could be linked. Another example is perhaps in practice research disciplines where an output is more broadly categorized in terms of a body of work. So there are different elements, for instance, an exhibition catalogue as well as an exhibition and all the activity around that sort of compiles a body of work which may be a more appropriate underpinning research for the impact than individual outputs alone. In terms of the quality threshold for underpinning research, we recognise that there are some challenges for institutions in ensuring that the two-star criterion of underpinning research quality was met in the previous exercise. So we're seeking views on whether we could focus the quality criterion on the concept of rigour alone. This is really to reflect that, so previously it was based on a wider concept of international quality in originality, significance and rigour. But there could be a view that if the research has led to impact, that originality and significance are less important than the concept of rigour. So seeking views on whether that's an appropriate focus for determining the quality of the underpinning research, or and how that could be defined in practice. So the feedback we've had on these proposals in the assessment so far, we've had support for alignment with the research councils, but with possibly some confusion over the eligibility of impact on teaching coming from that inclusion of academic impact in the consultation document. So again, just to clarify, it would be our intention that academic impact is captured under the output section of the exercise. But as with the previous exercise, impact on teaching out with the institution would continue to be eligible. We've heard that some of these issues are important for the panels to reflect on. So early panel discussions and development of the panel criteria are important here as well in terms of any additional guidance and interpretation given. With regard to broadening the underpinning research relationship to the impact, there has been support for this broader basis, recognising some of the constraints around submitting impacts to the last exercise. But there also has been some concern expressed about how the boundaries are drawn for that, for instance, and how institutions will be able to assess the eligibility, as well as concerns relating to where individuals perhaps move institutions throughout the period and how eligibility on that basis would continue to work. With regard to the quality threshold, we've heard there's been sort of more limited discussion on this aspect, with some support in some areas, but also some concern about whether you can reasonably separate out rigour from originality and significance, whether that would in fact be any less burdensome, and also whether discipline-based differences would need to be included in definitions of rigour. So we've got one more slide to discuss the remaining proposals on impact. These are some of the more technical proposals. We've got two around the evidence for impact. We've separated this out in terms of evidence that is included within the case study to demonstrate the reach and significance thereof. And we're asking whether it would be helpful to provide some standardised guidance on including any quantitative data, balancing that against any suggestions of preferences or hierarchies of evidence, but just really to help standardise the inclusion of quantitative data across the body of case studies where helpful. And secondly, we're asking whether that evidence that was collected by institutions to corroborate the claims made in case studies but was held in institutions in case of audit, whether that evidence should routinely be provided to the panels. We're also proposing that the impact template, what was Ref 3A, moves into the environment section of the exercise. We've had mixed, during our evaluation of Ref 2014, we did hear mixed views about the best place for this impact template, whether it best fits with the case studies or with the remaining areas of the environment described. So as I say, we're proposing it moves into the environment section, but seeking views on the appropriateness of that. In terms of the total number of case studies required to be submitted, we are proposing that the total number received in the exercise does not exceed the total number submitted last time. So we're looking basically for around 7,000 impact case studies again. We think it's important that we maintain the overall number, but we want to guard against increasing this further in view of the cost and effort involved for institutions in developing these case studies. However, the exact number to be returned will need to be developed in relation to the FTE number of staff in units, but we are proposing that it could reduce to a minimum of 1 per submission for those smaller units, but seeking views on that proposal, particularly in relationship to the moving of the impact template which would then mean that for some units, the submission was based on, for the impact subprofile, on one case study alone. The final area around impact that we're seeking views on are guidelines on principles around case studies with examples of impact that were returned in 2014. So these would be case studies where impact continued to arise during the new period and where the underpinning research was eligible within the new time frame, but where the example is one that had been submitted previously. So we're asking whether there's any need for any evidence of additionality in those case studies, whether the panels need to know that it was submitted last time, or whether these should be treated on the same basis as all the other case studies. What we're seeking to achieve here is striking the right balance between incentivizing longer term activity, which these sorts of case studies would continue to show, as well as allowing new areas of impact to come through. So just to reflect briefly then on the feedback we've had so far on these proposals, we've had some support for collecting all of the audit evidence. So that bit has been sort of more widely accepted, though with some concern about the potential burden on panels in potentially having to read all that audit evidence. So some guidelines there about how the panels use it. But there's been a bit more trepidation about introducing set standards for the data in the impact evidence included within the case studies themselves. We've had broad support so far for moving the impact template into the environment section. But with regard to the ratio, we have had some concern voiced about a subprofile based on one impact case study, and this relates particularly to those examples of impact where they're perhaps focused on the work of an individual, which then gives quite a lot of visibility to that individual, as well as it being quite a high risk-reward strategy. In terms of guidelines for submitting impacts returned in 2014, we've had mostly not much support for any limits around that, whether that's in terms of the number allowed, so for instance introducing any sort of proportion on those that were returned last time, or any need for additional evidence. So that concludes the proposals on impact, and we'll now pause to take some questions.
Thank you, Kim. So we've had a couple of questions. First, to look at the body of work. So someone has asked whether the body of work as part of this underpinning research could include non-research related activity. I don't think that is the case. It would expect it to be a body of research work. I think Stern's proposal really is about enabling institutions to submit impacts that are based on a broader body of research, rather than having to, or some of the challenges that were faced in the last exercise around linking a very particular research output to that impact. So it's about broadening that definition. One of the common examples, so this question does ask if we can give more details and examples of what is meant. One of the common examples used is around policy impact, and the body of research that an individual has produced or been part of, leading to their advisory work informing policy impact. So it's how we might try and incorporate that body of work rather than one particular piece of research and that individual's then advisory role to inform policy. Kim, I'm conscious you had a conversation about practice-based research, and there's some examples from that community too.
Yes. So just to reflect a bit further on that. So the boundary between or the definition really of an output can be more fluid in, I think, these discipline areas, and the concept of a body of work may more readily apply in terms particularly of what underpins an impact. So for instance, the work involved in creating an exhibition, so the exhibition itself, the exhibition catalogue and all the related activities would therefore be included as the underpinning research.
Great. So to move on to one of our other questions, is it always so clear-cut that academic and wider impact can be identified separately? There are perhaps useful connections between these in many cases. Yes, I don't think we're intending to dispute that. We recognise that if a piece of research has, or some if research has wider impact, there may well be academic impact as well. So we're not trying to suggest that these are exclusive definitions. What it is really about what the REF is trying to assess, and it's the impact element of the REF is really about what broader benefits that research has had beyond the home institution. So I think that's really what this is trying to pick out, rather than suggesting they are exclusive definitions that could only apply to one or the other. We've also had a question: do you envisage the UOA case study format to change? There have been suggestions of additional fields that these are tweaks rather than major changes. I think that is the case. So broadly, I think we would expect the UOA impact case study format to have the 4 sections that it did for REF 2014. One suggestion has been whether the underpinning research box should actually be later in the case study, because the current approach suggests a rather linear approach to impact, that the research must have happened and been completed and been published far ahead of the actual impact itself. So whether by making the impact case study address the impact and then the research that underpins or is associated with it, maybe rather than underpins it, would help to kind of get past this linear approach to impact. But broadly, we'd expect the sections of the case studies to be the same. In terms of additional fields, I think our expectation isn't this would necessarily ask for extra or different information from REF 2014, but how we might standardise or format that so that it enables make it easier for the panels to identify the kind of the eligibility points within the case study. For instance, I mean, this may change a little bit if we have a body of research work, but for the underpinning research last time, the way institutions presented some of the details for the outputs varied greatly, and if we can standardise that in terms of the metadata associated with outputs, that might make that easier. From the other point of view, the analysis of impact case studies that was undertaken after REF 2014 also relied on quite kind of broad contextual information, and if we can help kind of standardise any of that, or suggest any drop-down lists, or anything that might kind of more structure the template more clearly for that. But so your thoughts are welcome on that as part from your consultation response. But again, this is intended as tweaks rather than anything else. We've also had a question. I have heard discussions on quality, e.g. if a unit of assessment has 4-star at a large scale, they might be then awarded a 5-star. Can you discuss? This hasn't come from us, that one, I have to say. There are often a few REF myths that start to circulate amongst the sector. I suppose in the evaluation of impact in REF 2014, some of the panels suggested that they would have liked more points on the scale for assessment of impact, so that might have included a 5-star, but there is no suggestion that we would introduce a 5-star partway through the process. So simply receiving a lot of 4-star impact case studies wouldn't then award the unit of assessment with a 5-star. So this is definitely not a proposal that's come from us.
Yeah, that's right. I think just to add to that, I think the panels were looking for perhaps more granularity in the way that they approach the assessment of impact. So that would be an issue that we would consider for the panel criteria.
Okay. I think that's probably all the time we've got for questions on impact. So shall we move on? I'm just going to mute the webinar slightly so we can organise ourselves for the next part of the presentation. So you may hear a slight pause before we talk again. Okay, so some of the proposals around the unit of assessment, level assessment of environment. So our proposals are relatively straightforward for this aspect of the assessment. They're suggesting that the environment template, so this is the textual part of the environment submission that includes details of what it is about the department or research that kind of produces an excellent research base or is conducive to that. And it's how that statement might be better structured, whether it's necessary to provide further sections or more quantitative data to support that submission. So our proposal is that it to be more structured with more data. We've also proposed, and we will be seeking advice from the Forum for Responsible Metrics about common indicators that might be included as part of this quantitative data to ensure that there is parity across submissions and across institutions, the type of quantitative data that could be provided to panels as part of a more structured and data-based environment submission. So the feedback we've had through the events is recognition, I suppose, mostly from panel members that attended some of the consultation events, of the difficulties in assessing the environment statements in the kind of information they provided and how difficult it is to differentiate between them, and that a more structured approach would help them to compare the different sections of a research environment more readily and assess those then directly. The feedback we had was support for a more structured approach, including more quantitative data as part of the assessment of environment, but this shouldn't be done exclusively. So I think institutions recognise that although data was helpful, it was important to still have that narrative section of the case studies. The limited discussion of potential common indicators. So again, as Kim said at the start of the webinar, this environment wasn't a focus of the consultation event. So this has kind of been gleaned through additional plenary discussion, but it wasn't a question that we directly asked those that attended. But we would be interested in your consultation responses of what kind of common indicators that might exist, for us to then discuss, obviously, with the Forum for Responsible Metrics around that. I suppose we do already collect some aspects of quantitative data. So this was the REF for A, B and C in REF 2014. So alongside the written submission, there was data aligned with HESA on research income in terms of research grants and contracts and research degree awards, as well as income in kind data that was collected. Broadly speaking, I think this was positively received, and at least one comment at the event that this was helpful, that it was aligned with HESA and fairly straightforward to repurpose and provide that data within the REF units of assessment. So we would expect, I would broadly expect us to include similar measures and similar data again. The timetable within the REF consultation document proposes a start date. I think it refers to research income, but that is intended to cover research degree awards as well, starting from the kind of beginning of August 2013, so slightly ahead of some of the other data for REF 2021, but this would capture the point, the kind of the last point at which the HESA data was collected for the last exercise. And so that's the intention of that, just to clarify. So one of the other points of feedback or slight areas of discussion was around open access. So there are some proposals there is a proposal in the consultation that there might be the opportunity to gain additional credit or enhance your score by showing what good practice you have implementing around open access policy and how this goes beyond the requirements of the REF in terms of output submission. This wasn't very well received. There was some concern about what it actually meant and how fair it might be on different types of institution. And so that's kind of the broader feedback we had about open access in environment. In terms of what should be included in the environment section, the feedback we've had suggested that there needed to be more emphasis on equality and diversity, and this might be captured in a more clearly structured template to allow institutions to really focus on the efforts they're putting in, or the departments, sorry, on the efforts they're putting in on equality and diversity, and also on sustainability and what that kind of the research environment, how sustainable that is. We're kind of conscious that for different institutions and for different subject areas, there might not be large injections of additional money to support new facilities, but how sustainable is that department? And the feedback we've had is that the departments would really like an opportunity to showcase their improvements in what they do in that space. So I think that is pretty much all we've got to cover on the unit of assessment level for environment. Kim, have there been any questions on this bit?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. So one, in relation to equality and diversity, would something like Athena Swan be a metric included in the environment assessment? And so certainly that is absolutely the sort of thing we're thinking about. That was included quite often by submitting units in REF 2014. I think something we would need to think about when we go on to the rest of the presentation to explore in a minute the institutional level assessment is the relationship between some of the metrics on equality and diversity in a unit level template and an institutional level template. And also what information could be included about equality beyond gender, so around ethnicity, disability, and the other protected characteristics as well.
Should I say on Athena Swan, we're hoping to publish a report that's currently underway, which has analysed some of the equality and diversity features that were mentioned in the environment templates for REF 2014. So this is a report that's been, some analysis has been done by CRAC on our behalf, and hopefully in the next month or so that will be available. And it does look at kind of mention of terms like Athena Swan and how prevalent they were in REF 2014 submissions. I think kind of the extent to which Athena Swan existed across subjects was different back then, and so there are probably advances in that area. But if you are interested in kind of in what we knew last time, and I think we expect it to give us a bit of a steer or some help on how guidance we might include in relation to E&D for the environment next time round. So hopefully that report will be published in the next month or so.
Sort of following on from the metrics, somebody else has mentioned that there are a lot of metrics collected elsewhere that underpin elements of the environment section, such as Athena Swan Sustainability Awards and so on. It would be great if there was a common set of these that are incorporated, so we are comparing like with like. Just to emphasise again, we will be working with the Forum for Responsible Metrics to consider the range, so it's really helpful to have your input on the types of metrics that can be included. And certainly it is useful to think about what we'll be able to give a picture to the panels across the piece so that they can look at this data in a meaningful way. However, it's also important that the diversity of unit types is allowed for in the assessment process, and so retaining a narrative section alongside the metrics will be important for institutions to be able to present their relevant context alongside that data, but much shortened narrative statements as outlined. Okay, so we've had one further question, which is around, have there been any comments about interdisciplinary research, income and HESA cost centres? As already expressed in the discussions on staff, the HESA cost centres don't serve interdisciplinarity well. We actually haven't had that many discussions as yet around the environment element, so this hasn't been an issue that has come up significantly. It's my understanding that research income and students in HESA can be assigned to units of assessment, but we do very much welcome your views on any issues that are being presented, particularly if we are intending to present income per FTE. We will need to give careful thought around that.
Yeah, so I know that the obviously last time round the research income was aligned with HESA data, and so we had that in HESA cost centre form and kind of gave that back to institutions so that you could then allocate the income to the unit of assessment as you saw fit based on the kind of the broader HESA cost centre mapping. So I suppose in your consultation response, if you feel that that isn't enough to allow you to kind of to cover or to address interdisciplinary research income, then we'd be interested in your thoughts on how we can better use research income, because all of the research income that your institution has will be returned to HESA. Appreciate that perhaps not in the in an interdisciplinary structured way, but it would be interesting to hear how that works for you in an institution and how that affected your submission last time round, I suppose.
There's one further question that we had actually in relation to impact, but I think it's relevant here in relation to the environment as well. So some feedback from panels expressed the view that the impact template provided helpful context for understanding the case studies, and if this goes into environment, will panels have access to that information as well? So I think I mentioned when I was discussing these proposals that we had actually received a bit of a mixed view on where the template best fitted, and indeed one of the key points around it staying with the case studies was to enable panelists who are assessing the case studies to have access to the statement as well. So that is something we'd certainly need to think about and explore with the panels and discuss whether having access to that statement, particularly for the impact assessors who aren't involved in any other aspects of the assessment, just the case studies, whether that would be helpful for them to see. Okay, so we'll just go on mute again as we set up for the next section. Okay, so the next section of the consultation that we're going to look at is the institutional level assessment. So we'll take the impact, the proposed impact case studies first, and then pause for questions there before moving on to think about the environment, the institutional level environment. So the proposal for impact case studies at the level of the institution was included in the Stern review of the REF, and came from the perspective that there were impacts in 2014 that institutions may have had challenges returning because of the UOA structure. So recognising really that the way that impact occurs may not reflect the discipline structure of the units of assessment in REF. And therefore giving increased flexibility for institutions to submit these examples of case studies that may not neatly fit, those arising from multi and interdisciplinary or collaborative research across the institution. And therefore we are proposing that between 10 and 20% of the total impact case studies required by that institution is returned at the institutional level. This would be a minimum of one for those smaller institutions. It's clear that a pilot would be required to test the proposals. This is a new, a completely new element of the assessment at the institutional level, and it would need to be explored carefully. In terms of the feedback we've had on this aspect, quite often individuals have reflected on the analysis that was undertaken on the case studies following the 2014 exercise, which actually identified that a very high proportion of the case studies returned were in fact, could in fact be classed interdisciplinary. And so it has not been clear to many delegates what the issue here is that needs to be solved, and whether in fact the institutional case study would be the right mechanism to do that. Some of the particular concerns that have been raised are those around the relationship between the submitted units case studies and the institution. So, for instance, some concern that submitted units may get defensive about their case studies, or have concern that the institution will, that the best examples within that submitted unit may be taken off the unit to be used at the institutional level. There's also there have also been questions raised about exactly what an institution-level case study would need to look like. Would there be a minimum number of disciplines that needed to be involved, or how would it look different to a unit case study, if at all? There's also concern about game playing in relation to the weighting proposed on this element. We'll come on to a slide in due course that sets out how we propose the institutional level assessment is taken into account in the weighting, but of the 20% for impact case studies, we're proposing 5% is for the institutional level assessment. So we've had a number of suggestions made around this aspect that are seeking to address the potential concern around the visibility of interdisciplinary case studies, and also around the activity at the level of the institution in impact itself. So suggestions perhaps that the institutional impact strategy could be a clearly defined area within the institutional level environment template, which we'll come on to reflect on in a minute, and perhaps then could link to or describe a number of the interdisciplinary case studies that are submitted across the differing units. Or, for instance, flagging up duplicate case studies, which is examples where submitted to more than one unit of assessment where they've involved researchers across multiple disciplines within institutions, or flagging up those that are interdisciplinary. So we have had a lot of reflection on this aspect in particular, the impact aspect of the institutional level assessment, but also some quite constructive input into actually some of the issues that are trying to be addressed through this proposal could be approached in another way. So we'll pause there and I'll hand over to Anna to address any questions we've had on this aspect.
Yes, so one question, almost a comment. What is the perceived additional benefit of institutional impact? Doesn't this just bias the assessment towards large HCIs with commercial investment in things like science parks and move away from the focus on core research? That is something that we, if that's your sense, and that is something that came through in the consultation events, that perhaps institutional assessment of impact would be favour larger multi-faculty institutions. I think the perceived benefit is intended to be around impact case studies that you may not have felt able to submit in the last exercise because they didn't fit neatly within the unit of assessment structure. Obviously, as Kim's pointed out at the feedback at the events, that actually this wasn't a problem that people felt they had. But obviously, welcome your thoughts in the consultation response.
I suppose as well, just to add a couple of perspectives that we've had on what opportunities this may offer institutions. So one individual I was speaking to mentioned that it could be helpful for showcasing perhaps a lot of activity that the institution has been doing in the region, which would not necessarily map to units of assessment in any particular way, but would give an opportunity to talk about that activity in the local area.
Okay, thank you. So a question, how would institutional case studies relate to numbers of FTE? So the number of impact case studies at unit of assessment level would be broadly based on the FTE. The exact multiplier is yet to be ironed out, particularly if the minimum is now one impact case study, and depending on our definition of research active in terms of what that FTE encompasses. But when we have the FTE, the number of case studies at unit assessment level, that's where it relates to this 10 to 20% at institutional level. So I think that's kind of the relationship there.
That's right. So for each unit within the institution has a required number that's added up to give you the required number for the institution as a whole, and then as Anna said, the institutional level ones would be 10 to 20% of that total number.
Yeah. Another comment, I think the institutions are going to need to be armed with absolute clarity with the definition of interdisciplinarity versus, say, collaborative research or multidisciplinarity. This has been raised at a number of events. What is the definition that we're referring to? I think we're conscious that this is a much broader debate in terms of what the definition of what the suitable term, be it interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and a number of others. And so the extent to which the ref can answer that question, is up for debate, I suppose. I mean, I think broadly we would want a definition, or we want to be as broad and as encouraging of as wide range of research as possible. I don't know if there's anything else we can really say on that at this point.
No, that's right. I think it is a particular challenge to nail this down, and it's certainly not something we'd want to do, in a way that would then be exclusive. What we will do is work with our interdisciplinary research advisory panel to set out the guidelines and criteria around interdisciplinary research where it's relevant in the assessment.
Okay. What is the thinking behind introducing this new element partway through the cycle? It is the only new element. It should be an option for 2021, with an expectation it will be compulsory next time round. That's the kind of comments we've had on a number of the proposals made about whether we should introduce this at this stage or not. That's partly one of the reasons for undertaking a pilot of institutional level assessment of impact, to understand how possible this really is for institutions and the extent to which it can be put into place for this exercise. But that's a comment that has been made. And then, can a given case study be submitted to more than one unit of assessment in the same institution? I think in the same way that was possible in REF 2014, so where the underpinning research relates to multiple units of assessment, we wouldn't want to restrict or limit the extent to which you could then return it to more than one unit of assessment. So the same would apply there. So I think that is most of the questions. Oh, hang on, I'll just have another quick look. Sorry, we have them coming in thick and fast. Bear with me one moment. So to what extent is there hard evidence that there were case studies that HIs didn't submit, that they would have done had there been an institutional option? I suppose we haven't collected any hard evidence of that point, and the feedback we've had through the events that wasn't the case. Particularly our analysis of the case studies of REF 2014 found that a lot of the underpinning research was based on a broad range of research, not necessarily directly related to the particular unit of assessment. So we don't have any hard evidence to that, although I think there's probably further evidence related in Lord Stern's call to evidence on this point.
Yes, and I think there was certainly the feeling emerging from the panels particularly, and the impact assessors on the panels, that impact was actually much less discipline based than the outputs element of the exercise, and that it could be assessed in a different way, so that you could approach it by types of impact, for instance, or at main panel level, for instance. So I think this is also partly recognising that the discipline, the UOA structure in the REF is relevant obviously to the underpinning research, but that impacts do cut across.
Okay. So we've also had a comment, not sure why interdisciplinary could not be strengthened within the environment section overall strategy rather than separate submission of impact case studies. I think that's a comment we have already received and understand, and there have been some support for kind of an interdisciplinary section of the environment return, both at unit assessment and institutional level. So a question, when will the pilot take place? So when will we know if this is part of the REF or not? It depends a little bit on the consultation responses, first of all, as to and that decision will be taken as to when this will be part of the REF, on the basis of that as well as any pilot work. So the pilot work would be timetabled for the autumn of this year. Okay, I think we shall move on now. So bear with me a moment while I just mute us. So we're on to the institutional level assessment of environment. So one of Lord Stern's recommendations was that environment shouldn't only be assessed at unit of assessment level, but there was also a role for the institution to give recognition for and also encouragement for the institutional support or the overarching role that an institution has to support the departments within it. This was also based on some comments around duplication of content. So some of the unit of assessment environment templates had sections which were duplicated across units where they reflected institutional level activity and not just department level activity. So whether there was a role to streamline and reduce the burden on institutions by creating an institutional level assessment of environment as well. So the feedback we've had on this is that they're broadly in support and some recognition and understanding of a need for an environment level submission or a role for that, particularly for institutions where some sections of the environment template were produced centrally, and so that would streamline that and make it easier if it was submitted as an institutional level assessment. However, there was also some concern about how this might be different or differentially affect small and specialist institutions, and a need for this kind of institutional level assessment to be fair and a level playing field across all types of institution, recognising the diversity of the sector. Some small specialist institutions, for instance, might only submit to one unit of assessment, and so there were some comments about how difficult it might be to differentiate between the institutional and the unit of assessment level, where in some cases this is much one in the same. There was also a query about the impact of an institutional level assessment for joint submissions. So where universities work together to put one submission into a unit of assessment, how this institutional level environment, how that would be produced, and the extent to which that might impact the overall outcomes for that one submission, where there are two institutions involved or more than two institutions involved. The consultation events also addressed how this might best be assessed and whether a separate institutional level panel would be the appropriate group to look at institutional level environment statement, but also whether to what extent the unit of assessment panels would also need to see this. A lot of the discussion at the events suggested that although this might be assessed separately, or there might be a separate statement, there was clear links between an institutional level and UOA environment, and there was a need to recognise the link between the two. And actually, it's how the institutional level environment is borne out in the unit of assessment that is important. Therefore, the panel members would need to, the unit of assessment panel members would need to see this institutional level statement as well. So this, and there was also kind of related to that, and this link between the centre, so the institutional level assessment, and the departments, the extent to which that was a strong relationship, and the fact that this proposal is based on the idea that an institution is helpfully supporting the department, rather than there are some comments on the individual departments actually being the high-star quality departments leading the institution rather than the other way around. So on the basis of some of this feedback, there were some constructive comments at the events that rather than having a separate institutional level environment panel and a separate submission for this assessment, that actually it was best assessed within the unit of assessment. And so there should be a section within the UOA environment template which addresses this institution. So this would be a duplicate statement, so the same statement would be provided, but this was actually provided to the unit of assessment for review in relation to the UOA environment instead. So related to this, there was some discussion on the quality weighting and profiles. So we'll go on to talk about weightings and profiles in the next section, but that as part of lead on from this idea that the institutional environment should only be assessed at UOA level, this shouldn't have a separate quality profile, or if it does, it should be lower in recognition of the fact that it really is how the unit of assessment environment is affected by the institution, rather than just what the institution does. So some quite strong steers in terms of how we might effectively implement Stern's recommendations in relation to this. So we'll now move on to some questions on that point.
Anna, you've done a fabulous job, I think, explaining this. We haven't had, as yet, any particular questions on the environment section. So in view of the time, I think we'll just move straight on to the outcomes and weighting section. Just going on mute again to enable us to move on. Okay, so the overall quality profile will, the proposals are to combine it as this slide shows. So sticking with 65% for outputs, as with REF 2014, 20% for impact and 15% for environment. This slide also shows our proposed incorporation of the institutional aspects of the proposals. So as I mentioned earlier, 5% for institutional level impact within the sub-profile for impact and 7.5% for the institutional level environment. So we have had some feedback on these weightings. Overall, in terms of the sub-profile weightings at 65, 20 and 15, there has been general support, particularly for impact at 20%, particularly given the impact templates move into environment. It sort of is a de facto increase in the weighting on the case studies, which that there has been general support for, with the exception of some concern about those units which would have one case study only. We've also had, as Anna has touched on, concern about the weightings for the environment aspect of the institutional level assessment being at 7.5% there in the environment sub-profile, with the view that certainly if it is being assessed at the unit level, that needs to be reduced or in fact not reflected at all. So we are seeking views on how we could incorporate the institutional level assessment in alternative ways to that we have proposed in the consultation document. So seeking your views on that aspect as well. Okay, so that takes us to the end of outcomes and weighting. So we'll just mop up any further questions on these aspects.
So there is one question about kind of institutional case study weighting. Can you comment on the view that the proposed weighting will penalise those departments' unit assessments which scored well last time and have a strong portfolio in preparation for next time? So I think this is something, if it's what I think it is, this is the kind of some feedback we had at the events about how institutions might choose which their institutional impact case studies are, and taking those from units of assessment and the potential political difficulties there might be, and those unit of assessment with a strong portfolio might be those where the institutional level case studies are effectively taken from, and how this weighting for the institutional level case studies, being particularly higher, might affect that where they select them and how they're allocated. So I think we recognise that that's a fair point, and if there is potential game playing about how impact case studies are selected for either UOA or institution, depending on that weighting, and which would be a kind of an artificial artifact of the kind of that scoring approach. So we are aware of that, but would welcome any kind of further consequence in your consultation response.
Yes, I think we've also had reflection at the events on the effect of including the 5% in the weighting across the sub-profile for different units, which would have the effect of either, depending on the relationship between the performance of the institution and the unit, bring up or bring down the sub-profile for individual units, and welcoming, therefore, also your reflections on this potential consequence.
Well, those are all the questions we've got. I think there was some at the very beginning of the webinar today on impact that we didn't have time to address, but noting the time, I think we'll have a look back through those and see if we can add those to an FAQ list that we're looking to publish later this week anyway. Okay. So just to reflect on some next steps before we draw to a close, the consultation deadline is Friday the 17th of March. So if you do have any questions on any of the proposals but within that time, please do email us at researchpolicy@hefki.ac.uk. We will then be spending some time analysing those responses, reading through all those that we receive alongside the other UK funding bodies, with a view to publish initial decisions on the REF in the summer 2017. So that will be decisions that hope to answer the proposals and the questions raised in the consultation, and that document will have to have been approved by all of the UK funding bodies and boards, and will be discussed extensively with across the 4 UK bodies and as part of the REF steering group, which is the governance arrangements for the REF. As part of this process, we'll also seek advice from the advisory panels listed here to help inform. So some of the early analysis that's coming out of the responses will be discussed with these 3 groups in order to try and come to those initial decisions. And as a result of that, any pilot activity will then be conducted at the second half of this year. So this slide just shows the broad timetable, so you can see the way in which the REF 2021 compares with the timetable for that happened, so how things happened for REF 2014. So you can see that the pilot work and kind of on early recruitment, but also the recruitment of main panels will take place later this year. And then the guidance documents and panel criteria will be published next year. So exactly what the form that will take will be dependent on the consultation responses, as discussed in one of our earlier webinars. And then you'll see the submissions phase, followed by the assessment phase in 2021, with a view to publish outcomes at the end of 2021. So I think that draws things to a close. As I mentioned at the start, we will be publishing the slides from all of the webinars today. The recordings for these webinars will then be available on Wednesday, and any FAQs that we need to publish for questions that either haven't been answered or those commonly raised will follow shortly after that.
Okay, so it's left me to now just to say thank you all very much for listening and continuing to engage with us. It's been helpful for us as always, and I hope it has also been helpful for you. Thank you.
Thank you.